I'm Sarah Jackson, host of Internal Comms Pro, the podcast, a listening experience choreographed to help you elevate your internal communications to the pro level.
Are you designing that meeting for consumption or contribution? If you infuse these into meetings, engagement will go up. And so when I think about virtual engagement, part of that, one component of that for me is what you're doing increasing or decreasing psychological safety? The story of how I identify these 5 ingredients was a series of probably 100 failures in 2020.
That's Chad Littlefield, co-founder and chief experience officer of We and Me Incorporated, an organization whose mission is to create conversations that matter. Leaders call Chad when they want to amplify connection, belonging, and trust in their organization. Forbes calls Chad a global expert on asking questions that build trust and connection in teams. He's a TEDx speaker, author of The Pocket Guide to Facilitating Human Connections, and creator of We Connect Cards, which are now being used to create conversations that matter on campuses and companies in over 80 countries around the world. Most recently, Chad and his partner, Will Wise, launched their new book, Ask Powerful Questions, Create Conversations That Matter, now a #1 Amazon bestseller. Chad's led workshops and trainings and retreats at JetBlue, Starbucks, and Johnson & Johnson. And today, he led me in a completely impromptu recording of today's episode. You see, I do a prep call before recording any episode. If you've been a guest on the show, you know this. But with Chad, he had the ability to create connection so quickly that I felt confident to take a risk, go with the flow, and record this episode blindly and in the moment. So get ready to see how Chad's ability to create connection before content choreographed today's show, and in the end, will help you too connect with your audience. And here we go. So, Chad, welcome to Internal Comms Pro, the podcast. If you wouldn't mind for our audience, just to introduce yourself and your company and a little bit about your backstory, where you're from.
Yeah. So many years ago, I saw the movie Patch Adams with Robin Williams, who became a doctor to really promote the quality of life. And I thought I had my whole life figured out. I thought I was going to be a doctor, and then I took a chemistry class in college and was like, this is not going to work out very well. But what I realized was, and what has become my life's work and career, and now the company that I started, We and Me, exists to make connection and engagement easy for some of the top leaders and educators on the planet. And I think going back to Patch Adams, there was a way, if you've seen the movie, there was a way that he just had this magical ability to empathize with patients. And so even though he wasn't necessarily the smartest or best clinician, he had a way of reaching people and upping his impact and improving patient outcomes because of the way that he was able to connect. And so I kind of set out on this life's journey to figure out, is that real, or is that just some made up Hollywoodized version of what connection can do? And it turns out I found in working with a lot of really cool organizations around the world that when we connect really deliberately and build cultures of connection, that performance goes up, that they're the companies that are not saying, man, morale is really low right now, or like everybody's really burnt out and really exhausted, because that connection builds some level of support system. So
Yeah. Well, you definitely have the ability to connect and connect quickly because as we were today, this is a completely impromptu conversation, which I've never done before because I'm a planner. And so when we talked, you thought we were recording, I thought we were preparing, and you're like, you know what? Let's just do it. And I never would have done it, but I did feel so comfortable immediately with you. So this is definitely a superpower that you have, and I can't wait to find out what's behind, what the special formula is or ingredients are to building such a connection and so quickly. So tell me, a little bit. I know we're going to be talking about 5 ingredients today to make the virtual space engaging, our listeners are still struggling with this and coming to me and saying, hey, what worked, maybe last year isn't working now and people are tired. So, how did you figure out these five ingredients? Let's start there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, I appreciate you sharing just about the impromptu and feeling that comfort when we hopped on offline just for a few minutes beforehand. I'd say that is the power that these five ingredients for virtual engagement that I've identified. And are there only five ingredients? No, right? There's probably more, but what I found is that these are easy, low hanging fruit. You don't need to learn a bunch of tech. It doesn't matter what platform you're on. If you infuse these into meetings, engagement will go up. And if it doesn't, anybody listening can find my email afterward and send me an angry email, and I'll send you a free deck of our cards or a book or something. I would say though that they help build what maybe you felt offline beforehand, which is this foundation of psychological safety. And whatever it was when we hopped on in the first few minutes, and you're like, no, I think we could do an impromptu chat, right? I think we could actually just roll with this. I think if anybody listening is familiar with Google's research, and they ran a project called Project Aristotle to try to identify the characteristics of the highest performing teams at Google. And the number one characteristic that they found was psychological safety, which is basically interpersonal trust. And so when I think about virtual engagement, part of that, one component of that for me is what you're doing increasing or decreasing psychological safety? And this relates to a number of other topics that you talk about on the podcast too. But it's essential to people being willing and comfortable enough to participate, to share ideas, etc. And so the story, to make a long story longer, the story of how I identify these five ingredients was a series of probably 100 failures in 2020, or 100 experiments, I should call them, where I learned, okay, like if I do this, does this increase virtual engagement? Maybe not. And so, my job especially through 2020, but even before COVID got all too popular, even before 2020, I was working with some of the most innovative all remote teams before there was virus present. And so from that work, learned how to sustain remote teams, not just keep them limping along, which is, I think, sometimes what we fell into in 2020 was like, okay, man, like morale just keeps dipping, energy just keeps dipping. How do we keep people afloat? And so these are ingredients I was using before, but then honed and refined. And so, an example to make this concrete, an example, the first one, I actually got the language from a guy in Australia named Mark Collard, who runs a company called Plamio, which is this really cool online database of interactive, engaging, collaborative exercises to bring a group together. Video tutorials, he's got a bunch of virtual adaptations. It's a really cool resource. But the idea that he introduced me to is that typically when we meet virtually, we reward, and in person, to be honest, we reward people for being late by waiting for them. So we're like, oh, Joe's not here. Let's give it another 3 minutes and start at 9:03 instead of 9. And the idea of an unofficial start says, let's start at 8:57 to honor the fact that people are here, and so start immediately with some purposeful engagement, and let that unofficial start roll a few minutes into the official start time to honor the fact that there are sometimes really good reasons why people are late, especially when we're working remote. Like computers need to be restarted, kids need to be set up with virtual school, whatever else is going on. And so what I started doing is, in the workshops that I was leading with companies and universities around the world, I started practicing unofficial starts. And I noticed that before I even said hi or welcome or I'm glad you're here or anything like that, I would hold up we've got this deck of cards called We Connect cards with a bunch of questions on it. And I would just hold up a card to the camera. And so the question might say, what is something you know really well? And so I'd start off with a workshop. The second people entered in, hey, in the chat, can you just drop your response to this question? What is something you know really well? And that led in for me to the opening framing, which is, hey, my perspective, even though I'm leading this workshop, my perspective is that you all are collectively way smarter than I am. And so in our time, my perspective is going to be that stuff that I don't know, and we're going to make this a very active participatory process where you're not expected to just consume. You're invited to contribute your perspective as well. And it did all of that. I didn't say all of those words, but kicking off right away with that unofficial start sets the tone for contribution rather than consumption. And so little things like that. So I could share similarly with the other four ingredients. But just to give that concrete example, that's how that became ingredient number one, is seeing it work over and over and over again. With just in 2020, it's probably hanging out on Zoom or some other platform, leading sessions, facilitating meetings with well over 10,000 people, and there were, I don't know, probably 500 to 1,000 of those people that I didn't do a great job starting immediate purposeful engagement. And I learned from those failures, added them to my failure resume.
Well, I love that you mentioned that part of the story because you do, present yourself so well polished. I mean, if you look at your website, which by the way, give that to me again. It's We and Me, right?
Yeah, it's www.weand.me.
Yeah. For all the listeners out there, you've got to check out this website. It's so well done. I love all of your videos. So, when we spoke, I'm like, oh, wow, I'm meeting with the big deal. And so I love that you mentioned the failure story because that has been a theme with a lot of our listeners, with myself, that typically internal communicators, boy, we got to have the polish on. Every word has to be perfect. And that sort of blew up for 2020 because we didn't have the time to become perfect. And we messed up so much, but I think it is one of the new hallmarks of an innovative internal communicators to take on that entrepreneurial, messy journey because look where it got you. And now you have such a great ingredient. And by the way, I'm buying so many of those decks of cards. I'm going to give them out to our guests and our listeners. I think they're so good, and our listeners love just real easy, tactical, easy to apply things. So I'm already getting jazzed about this first ingredient and the backstory behind that. So thank you for sharing that.
I love it. I was keynoting a internal communications conference in Boston a few years ago, and met the head of internal communications for Crayola, and she fell in love with the cards as well, and have been working with them, and they've been using them to create connection before content and mix up. They're really, really great for virtual context too, and so. The deck's got 60 questions, and so if you're like, man, we gotta like somehow keep these meetings fresh, there is enough material in the one deck for 52 weekly meetings to mix it up and spark that connection, both personally, but also related to work. So something that's kind of fun is the questions are all written in a way that you can add context to the end of them. So that question that I gave you an example of, what is something you know really well? You can add, what is something you know really well about your job, or what is something you know really well about being a parent, or right, and the whole deck changes. And so you can actually make the whole set of questions really specific to the meeting or gathering or purpose, or email that you're sending out right there. And so it's yeah, it creates a really nice template there. It's kind of like the infinite deck or something.
I love it. I love it. Well, take us to the next ingredient. I can't wait.
Yeah. So the next one, I appreciate that you're hooked, Sarah, because the next one is this idea of a context hook. And so I'll kick off with an example. So I was leading a workshop for a big insurance company a couple weeks ago, who shall remain nameless, because a lot of their executives were kind of uninterested in being there, right? It was like, we got to go to this leadership retreat thing, and I don't know if I really want to do it on Zoom, and yada, yada. And I was there to lead a workshop on how to make virtual engagement easy. And I knew that because there was some resistance, there needed to be some hook that brought them all into the same context and kind of align them with the purpose. And there's a couple ways to do this. One of the shortest and cheapest and lowest prep ways is to get really crystal clear about what your intention is and to share it with the rest of the group. And I'll unpack that in a minute. But the example that I gave to them was, right, in the first couple minutes of the gathering, I said, hey, my intention in the next 90 minutes is to be a painkiller for the next 100+ hours of virtual meetings that you have, whether you're in this session with me or not. I know that you're going to be in 100+ hours of virtual gatherings over the coming months, and for some of them, probably over the coming 2 weeks. And so that was the context hook to say, okay, even if there's some resistance and they weren't totally interested, like, man, painkiller for like, I'm feeling some pain in these virtual meetings. I feel exhausted at the end of the day after back-to-back meetings. So I'm interested. I'm going to tune in. I'm going to see what Chad has to say here. And so that idea of a context hook is really powerful. I said the word intention earlier. So for the more nerdy or sophisticated listeners, the Latin root of the word intention means to stretch or stretching. And I love that because I think a really good intention, and this applies to any facet of internal communications, in my opinion. A really good intention stretches over the needs of everybody in the group and pulls people together, right? It's different than an objective. It's different than a goal. Now, a goal or objective might incorporate the needs of the whole, but an intention is primarily focused around what somebody else's needs are, right? It's others-centric, we-centric rather than me-focused. And so getting clear about that intention and sharing it right at the beginning allows people to either choose to play the game or not. I think, especially in corporate land, we have lots of meetings where we say, we got to get aligned. Let's all get aligned. Let's get on the same page, right? And I think this is a really concrete way to do that, because when we don't get clear about our intention and share it, but we have intentions that affect other people, I would argue that is manipulation when we don't share them, right? When we have intentions that affect other people, but we don't share them, that is manipulation. That's trying to get somebody to do something that you want them to do without telling them exactly what it is, why it is, or what's in it for them. And so, thinking about communications and moving and shifting behavior and culture, et cetera, if somebody hasn't bought into your intention, it's much more unlikely that they're going to buy into whatever behavior or whatever else is being asked or shared in that moment.
Circle Broadcast is a proud member of the Internal Comms Pro Collective. Looking to get engagement and attendance up for your virtual events? It all starts with inviting the right people. With Circle Broadcast, you can directly invite target segments across every IC channel. But don't limit your virtual event invites by department or location. Automatically extend an invite to your employees who've expressed interest in those topics over time. To learn more about broadcast personalized cross-channel employee experience, visit circle.com/ICP. That's CERKL.com/ICP. So my impromptu recording with Chad is going good so far. Now in this next part, Chad gives us the remaining 3 ingredients. Now you'll want to listen to the end as Chad models how to wrap up your event with how he wraps up today's show. Now let's jump back in. Love this. I love this so much because our listeners, being internal communicators, are going to be so good at this because they do have a default of coming from a place of empathy, but also they are great, I think, at wordsmithing that context hook. Like I noticed you didn't use the word vitamin, you used the word painkiller in that. And so I think they will be so good, I think, at putting words to this. And again, another easy tactical thing you can do. And talking about Latin definitions, by the way, I'm so inspired to just by just even these first 2 ingredients. And the Latin definition of inspire is to breathe life into. So I think I can't wait to hear ingredient number 3 as we again breathe life and be inspired by getting another shot in the arm, speaking of painkillers, to continue on planning engaging virtual events.
Oh, I love it. I love the ping-ponging Latin roots back and forth, and love that we're continuing to be hooked. So let's, for the impatient listeners, I've got a little bit of ADD or ADHD. So let's turn these 3 ingredients to hyperdrive a little bit. So the third one, and I would say if you were to only choose 2, I would consider context hook and this one, which is connection before content. There is so much research there's a mountain of research that says when we connect meaningfully with each other, right, we can actually get work done better. There was a pretty wild study done at Johns Hopkins where they were trying to reduce medical errors and deaths on surgical teams. And so they tried all these interventions. The most impactful intervention was they had the surgical teams, from the techs to the surgeons to the nurses and everyone in between, to get together and just stand around, huddle around in a little circle, and share who they were, what their role was, and if they had any concerns for the surgery. And just that little chat, that little 5-minute connection before, they didn't call it connection before content in the research, but it was connection before content, I would argue. That the impact of that was that in surgeries, the teams met up and did that connection before content. Medical errors and deaths were reduced by 30%, which is kind of insane, right? So, and most people listening are probably you're probably not in the business of surgery, but I would say, and killing people necessarily, but I would say that we are always at risk on a weekly basis, Monday through Friday, always at risk of our meetings and our communications dying, right? And so this idea of connection before content, I would say, has three key ingredients, right? This is not an icebreaker. This is not a like get together and whip around the room and share what your favorite color M&M is. The idea of connection before content has to have these three elements. It's got to connect people to each other, right? So, which is a little bit harder when you think about asynchronous communications. But it's got to connect people to each other. Although it's not that hard, right? Because if you're featuring and elevating somebody within the organization and allowing people at scale to connect to that person's story, right? That's a form of doing or checking the box on this ingredient. The second one is it's got to connect to the purpose of why you are there or why people are there in that moment. And most connection exercises or team building or icebreaker sort of things miss that altogether. And then the third one, it's got to at least give people the choice or option for authenticity and vulnerability, which doesn't necessarily mean like, deep, dark secrets, but it means authenticity and vulnerability to me mean true. This is a who you are, and it's welcome to come out. And so the easiest way to check that box is to invite people's stories and to share and elevate people's stories, right? The brain is just wired to hear a story differently than it's wired to hear a communication or an idea or anything else.
Do you have, again, I know you've got the great cards. Are those ways to do this, the connection cards? Do you have prompts? Or I'm always looking for tactical resources where our listeners can actually execute this connection before content piece.
Yeah. We give away a ton of free resources and exercises on the site. So if you go to weand.me/ideas, there is a ton of stuff there that people can download and check out. So you can actually download a free version of the cards. So if you want to just pull those questions, we have another deck called We Engage Cards. And then an excerpt of me and Will, my co-founder's book, Ask Powerful Questions, Create Conversations That Matter, which is kind of provides this stepping stone to building a culture of connection before content as well. So yeah, lots of props, lots of really practical things. And then I also, if you just type Chad Littlefield into YouTube, I put out daily, which is kind of insane, but I put out daily YouTube tutorials on how to make connection and engagement easy. And so there's a ton of resources there that you can search for exactly what you want.
Well, and we'll make sure we link all that in the show notes. And I also love your mention now a few times already of the research, because a lot of our listeners, I think, can use and cite cite those sources and those science and data backed stories and articles as they're positioning themselves. They've been thrust into this leadership table. I think it's good to mention some of those things, because then they can mention those things when they're talking to leadership about maybe the why or some of their ingredients on how they plan on making these events virtual. So I love it.
Beautiful. This is fun. I'm enjoying this. We talked about the impromptu at the very beginning, but this is good. This is good stuff. So let's do lightning round for ingredient 4 and 5 for those of you who have a little bit of OCD and need to kind of make sure that we get to these. So 4 is usually the one that takes up 80% or more of a given meeting. And so if you were to map all these ingredients on a timeline from start to finish in any gathering. The fourth one is content, and the way that I would say that is the brain is wired to interpret language and numbers and pop them into short-term memory and then let them leave about 13 seconds later. It's the reason that a phone number is chunked by digits. We got little hyphens in between because the puny little 8-pound blocks that sit on the top of our necks can't hold a phone number long enough to dial it. Not that we actually really dial phone numbers all that often anymore, but you get the idea. And so for content, my invitation is just to think about with any level internal comms, and I think internal comms folks are inherently good at this as well, is the more visual and experiential you can make your gathering or communication, etc., the more engaging and remembered it's going to be. Because the brain loves, right? You might not remember your neighbor's name from where you grew up because it's language, but you could close your eyes and walk all around the streets and in and out of houses that you've been into, right? The brain can hold so much visual and experiential data. We just have a lower tolerance for language and numbers. And so thinking about minimizing that as much as possible. So that looks like, for me, really thinking about content, especially in a synchronous, like we're all jumping on to a meeting, thinking about, are you designing that meeting for consumption or contribution? Are you going around and everybody's just doing a report out or one person speaking 80% of the time? Or are you, even in a small group of 6 people, are you splitting out into 2 breakouts to have mini conversations and then bring back those ideas together? And so when we design for contribution, right, there's way higher engagement and tolerance for meeting online, but the tolerance for just consumption online, I think, is low, and it's getting lower the more we operate remotely. So the fifth one, I don't know if we're ready for it yet, Sarah, but it's closing. And so maybe we can do something kind of creative to close out a podcast. But I met a woman once who was about half my height, all white hair, maybe 80, 85 years old. And she introduced herself to me as a professional storyteller. I was like, ooh, tell me more about this. I wrote a book about asking questions. I got some questions for you. And when I asked her what her number one tip for telling really phenomenal stories was, she said, without any hesitation, she said, all you've got to do is know the first sentence that you're going to say and the last sentence that you're going to say. And I think the spin on that that applies to these ingredients is know the first thing you're going to do to invite people's contribution, and know the last thing that you're going to do to invite people's contribution. So often meetings close because you ran out of time and nobody paid attention to the clock, and you went over, people said, I gotta go, see you, hard stop, or I gotta switch over to another link or whatever. And I would say that meetings should properly end 10 minutes before the end time so that you have time to do an intentional closing to wrap up. And that would depend greatly on the context of why you're meeting. But one of the favorite exercises that I might close a workshop or a meeting with is an activity called Group Anthem, where I just simply invite people to make a closing statement that begins with either I am, I believe, or I will. And so, Sarah, I wonder if you have some logistical closing pieces for the podcast, but then maybe we can officially close with a closing statement, just on our time together here, that begins with either I am, I believe, or I will. Are you down to try it out?
I'm down. I'm down. I might. So you want me to come up with the statement, or are you going to do one too with me?
Yeah, we'll both do one. We'll both do it in whatever order. If you want to go first, I can follow. I don't know if you have any pieces that you want to share to close out the podcast or invite folks into, and then we can end with those lovely statements.
Yeah. Well, I can't, first of all, I can't thank you enough for giving us 5 ingredients. Our listeners love list, they love tactical things. And I believe they will immediately go to your website and just be able to take it's such value to be able to take something and immediately apply it. So, my closing statement, I am so grateful and so inspired to be able to get another shot in the arm to breathe life into all of our virtual strategies.
Ooh, I love it. I am positive that if even one idea from our conversation is put into practice, that it will open up a new possibility and breathe life into your own gatherings, meetings, communications.
Love it. Well, and Chad, like I said, you'll be seeing us on your website. I will buy that book and I will be promoting it to our guests. I think that's going to be such a great thing. Also, maybe to say, go leave a comment about our podcast and be entered to win. So we'll do something creative like that as well too to support you. And thank you for pushing me to do something impromptu, which is not normally my style. So my kids have encouraged me to go with the flow more in 2021. So I'm happy that I did and I took a risk because this was an amazing episode. I can't thank you enough for your time.
You can head downstairs and tell your kids that you went with the flow. It's already happened. Thanks for having me. It was super lovely to be on. It was good to connect here, and looking forward to connecting more, Sarah. Thanks for having me on.
Well, folks, there you have it. The 5 ingredients to planning an engaging virtual event. Now, we'll link all of Chad's resources in today's show notes. And if you refer a friend to subscribe to our newsletter or leave us a rating, let us know, and we'll enter you to win one of Chad's fabulous resources. Stay with us next week as our journey to uplevel your internal communications to the pro level continues.
Internal Comms Pro, the podcast, is produced by the Internal Comms Pro Collective and proudly supported by the Circle Broadcast Suite, an entire suite built for internal communicators. Learn more at circle.com. And don't forget to visit www.internalcommspro.com/show notes for our free resource guides. Thank you for listening.